The telegram arrived at Louis Armstrong's home in New York on April 10, 1938. King Oliver dead, Savannah, Georgia, April 8, funeral pending. Louis read those words and felt something break inside him that had been cracking for years. King Oliver, his mentor, the man who had taught him everything about music and performance, the cornetist whose band Louis had joined as a young unknown in 1922, was gone. Dead at 52 in a cheap boarding house, broke, forgotten by the music industry he'd helped create, his body awaiting burial because there wasn't enough money for a proper funeral. Louis immediately sent money to cover all expenses, but money couldn't fix what was actually broken, because King Oliver had died without ever forgiving Louis Armstrong, had died believing that Louis, his protege, his student, had betrayed him by leaving his band in 1924 to pursue solo stardom. 14 years of bitterness, 14 years of watching Louis become everything Oliver had wanted to be, 14 years of resentment that ended only with death, and now Louis had to attend a funeral for a man who had loved him like a son and hated him like a rival, who had given him everything and never forgave him for using those gifts to surpass his teacher. The funeral that broke Louis Armstrong wasn't about death. It was about unresolved love, unforgivable success, and the price of becoming who you're meant to be when it means leaving your mentor behind. In 1922, when Louis Armstrong was 21 years old and relatively unknown outside New Orleans, he received an invitation that would change his life. King Oliver, the legendary cornetist who had left New Orleans for Chicago and built a reputation as one of the greatest jazz musicians in America, wanted Louis to join his Creole jazz band as second cornet. This was an extraordinary opportunity. King Oliver was already famous, already the standard by which other cornetists were measured, and he was offering Louis, young and raw and unproven, a chance to play beside him, to learn from him, to share stages with the best band in Chicago. Louis accepted immediately and arrived in Chicago in August 1922, overwhelmed by the city, by the sophistication of Oliver's band, by the responsibility of playing second cornet to a master. Those early months were education and intimidation in equal measure. Louis would watch Oliver play and understand that he was witnessing genius. The tone, the phrasing, the improvisational brilliance, all of it was revolutionary. And Oliver, generous in ways that many successful artists aren't, shared his knowledge freely. He'd show Louis techniques, explain his musical thinking, demonstrate how to phrase a solo, how to build tension and release, how to connect with an audience emotionally rather than just technically. The relationship became more than professional. Oliver became a father figure to Louis, who had grown up without a stable male presence in his life. Oliver fed Louis when money was tight, defended him when other musicians questioned his abilities, encouraged him when self-doubt crept in. In return, Louis idolized Oliver, studied him obsessively, tried to absorb everything his mentor could teach. The Creole jazz band with Louis and Oliver on dual cornets became legendary. Their interplay, their harmony, their ability to anticipate each other's musical choices, all of it demonstrated what mentorship could achieve at its best. For 2 years, Louis learned under the protection and guidance of the man who would define his understanding of what it meant to be a musician. But by 1924, something had shifted. Louis had learned everything Oliver could teach him and had begun developing a musical voice that was distinctly his own. His playing had evolved beyond mimicking Oliver's style into something more adventurous, more technically virtuosic, more emotionally expressive. Other musicians noticed. Audiences noticed, record company executives noticed, and King Oliver noticed. He saw his protege becoming not just competent but extraordinary, not just good but potentially great, not just a student but a rival. When Lil Hardin, the band's pianist and Louis's future wife, suggested Louis should leave Oliver's band to pursue solo opportunities, the idea felt like betrayal and destiny mixed together. Louis loved Oliver, was grateful to Oliver, didn't want to hurt Oliver, but he also recognized that staying in the Creole jazz band meant staying in Oliver's shadow, playing second cornet forever, never fully exploring what he could achieve on his own. The choice was impossible and necessary. Stay loyal and remain limited, or leave and risk losing the most important relationship in his professional life. Louis chose to leave. In September 1924, he accepted an offer to join Fletcher Henderson's orchestra in New York, a prestigious opportunity that would showcase him as a featured soloist rather than second chair. He told Oliver with apology and gratitude, explaining that he needed to grow, needed to see what he could accomplish independently, needed to find his own voice. Oliver's response was cold and immediate. He felt abandoned, betrayed, used. He'd given Louis everything, taught him everything, and now Louis was leaving for a competing band that would benefit from all the knowledge and skill Oliver had imparted. The hurt in Oliver's reaction was genuine and complicated. He'd invested in Louis not just professionally but emotionally, had treated him like family. And in the hierarchical world of jazz bands in the 1920s, loyalty to your bandleader wasn't just professional courtesy. It was moral obligation. Louis leaving felt to Oliver like a son rejecting his father, like ingratitude, like theft of the musical knowledge Oliver had freely shared, now being taken to competitors who hadn't earned it. Louis tried desperately to maintain the relationship, wrote letters to Oliver, sent messages through mutual friends, expressed continued respect and gratitude. But Oliver had hardened, wouldn't respond, wouldn't acknowledge Louis's attempts at reconciliation. The bitterness grew as Louis's solo career took off. By the late 1920s, Louis Armstrong was becoming a household name. His recordings were bestsellers, his performances drew crowds, his innovations in jazz were being studied and imitated by musicians around the world. He was achieving everything Oliver had wanted to achieve, using techniques Oliver had taught him, surpassing his teacher in fame and commercial success. And King Oliver's career, meanwhile, was declining. The musical tastes that had made him famous in the early 1920s were shifting. Younger musicians were innovating beyond his style. His band struggled to find bookings. Record companies that had once eagerly signed him were now passing. By the 1930s, Oliver was no longer the king of anything. He was a has-been, a relic of an earlier jazz era, watching from the margins as his former protege became the biggest star in the genre. The decline was brutal and public. Oliver lost his band, lost his money, lost his health, suffered from gum disease so severe he could barely play cornet anymore, moved from city to city taking whatever gigs he could find, the quality and prestige of venues declining with each year. By 1937, he was working as a pool hall attendant in Savannah, Georgia, barely surviving, far from the spotlight that had once shone so brightly on him. And through all of it, through all the decline and disappointment, Oliver maintained his bitterness toward Louis, refused to forgive what he saw as betrayal, refused to acknowledge that Louis leaving might have been necessary for Louis's growth rather than cruel. Abandonment, friends tried to reconcile them. Musicians who knew both men would carry messages, would try to broker peace, would explain to Oliver that Louis still loved him, still respected him, still considered him the most important musical influence of his life. But Oliver wouldn't soften, wouldn't accept Louis's success as anything other than evidence of his own failure. The student had surpassed the teacher, and in Oliver's mind that wasn't triumph, it was humiliation. In April 1938, King Oliver died alone in a boarding house in Savannah, Georgia. Cerebral hemorrhage, quick and final. He was 52 years old, broke, forgotten by an industry that moves quickly past its pioneers. The landlady found his body. There was no money for a funeral, no family nearby to make arrangements, no record company or music organization stepping forward to honor a man who had helped create jazz as an art form. King Oliver would have been buried in a pauper's grave if Louis Armstrong hadn't intervened. When Louis received the telegram about Oliver's death, his immediate response was financial. He sent money to Savannah to cover funeral expenses, burial costs, everything needed to give Oliver a dignified farewell. But Louis also made a decision that revealed the depth of his grief and guilt. He would attend the funeral himself. Would travel to Savannah, a city in the Jim Crow South where a successful black entertainer could face real danger, to say goodbye to a man who had died resenting him. The funeral was small, a handful of local musicians who had known Oliver in his declining years, a few fans who remembered his glory days, and Louis Armstrong, famous and grieving, sitting in a colored-only section of a church in Savannah, staring at a casket that contained the remains of the man who had taught him everything and forgiven him nothing. The minister, who hadn't known Oliver personally, offered generic platitudes about faith and resurrection, but Louis wasn't hearing any of it. He was remembering 1922, the first time Oliver showed him how to phrase a solo, the first time they played dual cornets together and the crowd went wild. The encouragement when Louis was uncertain, the pride in Oliver's face when Louis nailed a difficult passage, and then Louis was remembering 1924, the conversation when he told Oliver he was leaving, the coldness in Oliver's response, the letters Louis wrote that were never answered, the years of watching Oliver's career decline while knowing Oliver blamed Louis for at least part of that decline, the guilt that came with success achieved partially through knowledge Oliver had given freely, never imagining his student would use it to eclipse him. Louis wept at that funeral, not quietly, not with dignity. He sobbed, shoulders shaking, making sounds of grief that made other attendees uncomfortable. Lucille, who had accompanied him, held his hand but couldn't console him, because Louis wasn't just mourning Oliver's death. He was mourning the relationship they'd never been able to repair. The forgiveness Oliver had never offered, the reconciliation that was now permanently impossible. After the service, Louis stood beside the grave as Oliver's casket was lowered into Georgia soil, and he said something quietly that only Lucille heard. "I'm sorry, Papa. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry you never understood why I had to. I'm sorry you died thinking I betrayed you. I'm sorry I couldn't make you proud without making you feel small." The apology came too late, 14 years too late, a lifetime too late. Louis returned to New York changed by the funeral. Friends noticed he was quieter, more contemplative, less quick to laugh. He'd always carried some guilt about his success, about the fact that his achievements had come partially by standing on Oliver's shoulders. But Oliver's death without forgiveness transformed that vague guilt into permanent wound. Louis would talk about Oliver in interviews for the rest of his life, always emphasizing how much he owed his mentor, always praising Oliver's genius, always careful to position his own success as derivative of Oliver's teaching rather than independent achievement. But that reverence couldn't change the fundamental truth. Louis had succeeded where Oliver had failed, had achieved fame, wealth, and lasting impact while Oliver died broke and bitter. And the question that haunted Louis after the funeral, the question that never had a good answer, was whether his success had required Oliver's failure, whether the only way for the student to fully emerge was for the teacher to be left behind, whether there had ever been a path where both men thrived, or whether Louis's ascension necessarily meant Oliver's decline. The mentor-protege relationship is always complicated by this dynamic. The mentor invests knowledge and opportunity into the student, hoping to create someone excellent. But if the student becomes too excellent, becomes competition rather than continuation, the mentor faces an impossible emotional position. Pride in having taught someone so successful mixed with resentment that the student has surpassed the teacher, joy at the student's achievements mixed with grief at one's own relative diminishment, love for the person mixed with envy of their success. King Oliver experienced all of those contradictions. He had loved Louis genuinely, had invested in him generously, had wanted him to succeed, but not this much, not to the point where Louis became more famous, more influential, more financially successful than Oliver himself. That level of success felt like betrayal because it highlighted Oliver's own declining relevance. Every article praising Louis as the greatest cornetist in jazz was implicitly demoting Oliver from that position. Every sold-out Louis Armstrong show was a reminder of the empty venues Oliver was playing. Every innovation Louis made was built on techniques Oliver had taught him but hadn't been able to monetize as successfully. Louis understood this intellectually, understood that Oliver's bitterness came from pain rather than genuine belief that Louis had done something wrong. But understanding didn't ease Louis's guilt, because there was truth in Oliver's resentment. Louis had benefited enormously from Oliver's mentorship and then used those benefits to outcompete his mentor. That's not betrayal exactly, but it's also not simple gratitude. It's the natural progression of talent and opportunity, but natural progressions can still hurt the people they leave behind. The question of what Louis owed Oliver haunted him for 33 years. Should he have stayed in the Creole jazz band out of loyalty, even if it meant limiting his own potential? Should he have rejected solo opportunities that would compete with Oliver? Should he have found ways to share his success more directly with his mentor? Or was leaving the only honest choice, the only path that respected both his own potential and Oliver's dignity? Because staying out of obligation, playing second cornet forever, not because it was right for the music, but because leaving would hurt Oliver's feelings, that would have been its own kind of betrayal, of himself, of the gifts Oliver had helped him develop. This dilemma resonates powerfully in 2026, in an era where career mobility is normal and expected. We tell young people to pursue opportunities, to develop their potential, to not let loyalty trap them in positions that don't serve their growth. But we rarely talk about the cost of that mobility, about the mentors and colleagues and institutions that helped you become who you are, then watch as you use what they gave you to move beyond them. About the relationships that break when ambition requires leaving, about the guilt that comes with success achieved partially by leaving behind people who invested in your growth. Louis Armstrong lived that guilt, carried it from King Oliver's funeral in 1938 until his own death in 1971. He never stopped talking about Oliver, never stopped emphasizing his debt to his mentor, never stopped trying retroactively to get Oliver's forgiveness and approval. But the one person who could have granted that forgiveness was dead and had died without offering it. That's the tragedy. Not that Louis left Oliver's band, that was necessary for his growth, but that they never reconciled before Oliver died, that Oliver carried his bitterness to the grave, that Louis had to live the rest of his life knowing his mentor died resenting him, believing Louis had betrayed him, unable or unwilling to see Louis's success as anything other than evidence of Oliver's own diminishment. The funeral that broke Louis Armstrong broke him because it made permanent what had been theoretical. The possibility of reconciliation existed as long as Oliver lived, even if that possibility felt distant. But death ended possibility, made the bitterness permanent, turned an unresolved relationship into an unresolvable wound. Louis would never get to explain himself in a way Oliver would hear, would never get Oliver's blessing on the career he'd built, would never repair what had broken in 1924. The funeral wasn't just about death, it was about the death of hope for resolution. In the years after Oliver's funeral, Louis became notably more generous with young musicians seeking mentorship. He'd help unknown artists share advice freely, provide opportunities, support their development in ways that mirrored how Oliver had supported him. And when those musicians would eventually leave to pursue their own paths, Louis would encourage them rather than resent them, would tell them stories about King Oliver, would explain that mentorship isn't ownership, that teaching someone means accepting they might outgrow you, that the student surpassing the teacher is success, not betrayal, if the mentor can find the grace to see it that way. Louis was trying to be for others what he wished Oliver could have been for him, a mentor who could celebrate rather than resent his student's success. But that generosity, that evolved perspective, didn't erase Louis's guilt about Oliver, didn't resolve the fundamental question of whether success achieved by leaving your mentor behind is tainted by that leaving. The only person who could have helped Louis navigate that complexity was Oliver himself, who could have said, "I'm proud of you, I'm hurt that you left, but I understand why you had to. Your success doesn't diminish what we built together. You took what I gave you and made it into something even greater, and that's exactly what a teacher should hope for." That conversation never happened, that reconciliation never occurred, that forgiveness was never granted. And at the funeral in Savannah in 1938, Louis faced the permanence of that absence. Oliver was gone, the chance to fix things was gone. The relationship would remain broken forever. Standing at that grave, Louis understood something profound about success and relationships and the costs of becoming yourself. That sometimes growth requires leaving, that becoming who you're capable of. Being might mean disappointing people who helped you get there. That mentors who give you wings can resent when you use those wings to fly away from them. And that all of this is tragic and necessary and unavoidable and heartbreaking. There's no clean resolution, no way to honor your debt to your mentor while also honoring your obligation to yourself. You make choices, you live with consequences. You carry guilt about the people you hurt even when hurting them was the only way to become yourself. Louis Armstrong carried that guilt until he died in 1971, 33 years after King Oliver's funeral. 33 years of success and fame and achievement, all shadowed by the knowledge that his mentor had died resenting him. 33 years of wondering whether there had been a better way, a path that didn't require leaving Oliver behind, a version of success that didn't feel like betrayal, but there wasn't. The only path to becoming Louis Armstrong required leaving King Oliver's band, required disappointing his mentor, required accepting that his success would highlight Oliver's decline, required living with unresolved guilt. The funeral that broke Louis Armstrong broke him because it revealed a truth he'd been avoiding, that sometimes you can't make everyone proud, that growth hurts people. That becoming excellent means surpassing your teachers, and surpassing your teachers means they're no longer the standard by which excellence is measured. That's devastating for the teacher, and it's devastating for the student who loved the teacher, and there's no solution, just the broken relationship, just the funeral, just the grave, just the permanent absence of the forgiveness you needed. King Oliver died in 1938, bitter and broke. Louis Armstrong died in 1971, successful and guilty. Both men were diminished by their unresolved relationship. Oliver lost the joy of seeing his protege succeed. Louis lost the peace that comes from his mentor's blessing, both trapped in a dynamic that neither created intentionally but both suffered from completely. That's the story, the funeral that broke Louis Armstrong, not because King Oliver died, but because he died without forgiveness, died bitter, died believing his protege had betrayed him, and Louis had to live with that belief for the rest of his life, successful and guilty, celebrated and broken, everything Oliver had hoped he'd become and everything Oliver had resented him for being, the mentor who taught Louis everything and forgave him nothing, the student who achieved everything and couldn't escape the guilt of his achievement, unresolved, permanent, heartbreaking, the funeral that broke Louis Armstrong.